Manager Bullies' new black intern in front of employees, unaware her husband was the CEO. The glass doors of Innovate Tech Solutions gleamed in the San Francisco morning sun as Kayla Washington adjusted her blazer one final time. 24 years old, armed with a Northwestern MBA and a notebook filled with carefully researched insights about the company, she took a deep breath and stepped into what felt like controlled chaos. The startup's open concept office buzzed with the kind of energy that made Silicon Valley legendary. Employees in hoodies and designer sneakers clustered around standing desks, gesturing wildly at massive monitors displaying colorful charts and code. The smell of artisanal coffee mixed with the faint hum of 3 different conversations about disrupting industries and scaling solutions. "You must be the new intern," came a voice from behind her. Kayla turned to find a woman in her 30s with a genuine smile and paint-splattered fingernails. "I'm Sarah, head of design. You look way too put together for this place." She laughed, gesturing at her own vintage band t-shirt. "Kayla Washington," she replied, extending her hand. "And I'm excited to be here. I've been following Innovate Tech's growth for months. Your user acquisition strategy in Q3 was brilliant." Sarah's eyebrows raised, impressed. "Most interns don't even know what Q3 means. You're going to fit in just fine. Come on, let me show you around before Brian gets here." As they walked through the office, Kayla absorbed every detail. The walls were covered with motivational quotes in trendy fonts, and there was an actual slide connecting the second floor to the first. But what caught her attention were the data visualizations scattered across various screens, some showing promising upward trends, others revealing concerning dips that nobody seemed to be addressing. "So you'll be working with our analytics team," Sarah explained, leading her toward a cluster of desks near the back. "Brian Morrison is your manager. Well, you'll see. He knows his stuff, but he's got strong opinions about how things should be done." Before Kayla could ask what that meant, a booming voice cut through the office chatter. "Where's our fresh meat?" Heads turned as Brian Morrison strode across the office like he owned the place. Tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a salmon-colored polo that somehow cost more than most people's rent, he commanded attention through sheer volume and confidence. His sandy hair was perfectly styled, and his smile was the kind that never quite reached his eyes. "Brian, meet Kayla," Sarah said, her tone noticeably cooler. Brian's gaze swept over Kayla from head to toe, taking in her professional attire with what looked like amusement. Well, Northwestern, right? Impressive. I'm sure you learned a lot of fancy theories up there." He emphasized theories like it was a dirty word. "Yes, sir. I'm really excited to contribute to the team and—" "Whoa there, Tiger," Brian interrupted with a chuckle that several nearby employees turned to watch. "Let's pump the brakes on the enthusiasm. This isn't debate club. We've got real work to do here, and I need someone who can follow instructions, not reinvent the wheel." Kayla felt her cheeks warm but maintained her smile. "Of course. I'm here to learn and help however I can." "That's more like it." Brian clapped his hands together. "Now, let's get you set up. Sarah, thanks for the tour, but I'll take it from here." As Sarah reluctantly headed back to her desk, shooting Kayla an apologetic look, Brian led her to a small desk tucked in the corner, clearly the least desirable spot in the open office. "This is your kingdom," he announced. "I've got a stack of reports that need number crunching. Nothing fancy, just basic data entry and verification. Think you can handle that without breaking anything?" Several team members had gathered around, ostensibly working but clearly listening. Kayla noticed their expressions, some sympathetic, others uncomfortable, a few amused by the show. "Actually," Kayla said carefully, "I noticed some interesting patterns in your Q3 reports. There might be an opportunity to—" "Hold up right there." Brian's voice got louder, ensuring everyone could hear. "Let me stop you before you hurt yourself thinking too hard. We didn't bring you here to think, sweetheart. We brought you here to crunch some numbers and learn how real business works. Save the big ideas for when you've got some actual experience under your belt." The office had gone noticeably quieter. Kayla felt 20 pairs of eyes on her, some curious, others pitying. Her prepared talking points about market segmentation and customer behavior analysis died in her throat. I understand, she managed, her voice smaller than she intended. Great! Now these reports. Brian dropped a thick stack of papers on her desk with a theatrical thud. Need to be input into our system by end of day. Pretty straightforward stuff, even for someone fresh out of school. As Brian walked away, already moving on to louder conversations about crushing Q4 targets, Kayla sat down at her corner desk and stared at the stack of papers. The excitement she'd felt walking through those glass doors had curdled into something much heavier. She opened her notebook, the one filled with insights about the company's potential, and quietly closed it again. Around her, the office buzz resumed, but she caught whispered conversations and sideways glances. Poor girl, someone murmured. Brian's such a jerk, came another whisper. But no one said anything directly to her. No one challenged him. Kayla Washington had walked into Innovate Tech that morning ready to prove herself, armed with ideas and ambition. Now, barely an hour later, she found herself relegated to data entry, publicly diminished by a manager who seemed to view her as entertainment rather than a team member. She picked up the first report and began reading, but her mind was already racing. The numbers told a story Brian apparently couldn't see, or didn't want to see. Customer churn was higher than reported, acquisition costs were climbing, and there were clear opportunities being missed. As she started entering data, one thought crystallized: she wasn't going to let Brian Morrison define what she could or couldn't contribute. Not today, and certainly not for the next 3 months. She just had to figure out how to prove it. The morning sun continued streaming through those gleaming glass doors, but for Kayla Washington, the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks into her internship, Kayla had developed a routine that would have impressed any efficiency expert. She arrived at the office 30 minutes early, when the space was quiet except for the hum of servers and the distant sound of the espresso machine warming up. Those precious 30 minutes became her sanctuary, time to review the real data behind Brian's polished reports. What she discovered made her stomach knot with frustration. Another decimal point error, she muttered, highlighting the mistake in Brian's latest customer acquisition analysis. It was the 4th one this week, and this time it inflated their success metrics by nearly 15%. The kind of error that could lead to disastrous decision-making if it reached the investors. She'd learned to work in layers, completing Brian's assigned busy work on the surface while conducting her own analysis underneath. Her notebook had grown thick with findings, overlooked market segments, misallocated budget projections, and customer behavior patterns that Brian's models completely missed. Morning, sunshine! Brian's voice boomed across the office as he strutted in at 9:30, his usual Starbucks cup in hand and that same self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. Hope you didn't break any computers while I was gone. Several team members looked up from their screens, exchanging those familiar glances, part amusement, part discomfort, all resigned to the daily show. Kayla had prepared for this moment. Actually, Brian, I noticed something in yesterday's acquisition report that might need a quick fix before. Whoa, hold up there, Nancy Drew. Brian interrupted, his voice carrying across the open office like a performer on stage. What did we talk about on day 1? Stick to your lane, remember? I've been doing this since you were probably studying for your SATs. But there's a calculation error that's affecting the projections. Calculation error? Brian laughed loud enough that heads turned from 3 desks away. You think I don't know how to add and subtract? That's rich. Listen, kiddo, I know you're eager to make an impression, but questioning my work isn't the way to do it. Jake from the marketing team shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maria from HR, who'd been walking by, slowed her pace but kept moving. Everyone could see what was happening, but Brian's reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed him kept mouths shut and eyes down. This became the pattern. By the end of the 2nd week, Kayla had quietly corrected 12 significant errors in Brian's models. She'd identified a customer segment in the Pacific Northwest that could increase revenue by 22% with minimal marketing investment. She'd spotted a pricing inefficiency that was costing the company roughly $8,000 monthly. None of it mattered. Brian. She tried again during a team meeting, her voice carefully measured. The retention data shows we're losing customers at a much higher rate in the 25 to 34 demographic. If we adjusted our messaging strategy to... There she goes again. Brian announced to the room, throwing his hands up dramatically. Our little intern here thinks she's spotted something we all missed. Tell me, Kayla, how many years of experience do you have in customer retention? Wait, don't answer that. I already know the number starts with 0. Nervous chuckles rippled around the conference table. Sarah caught Kayla's eye and offered a sympathetic shake of her head, but even she didn't speak up. Brian had a way of turning his attention on anyone who challenged him, and nobody wanted to become his next target. I was just suggesting, Kayla began. You were just suggesting that you know better than the guy who built this analytics department from scratch. Brian cut her off. The guy who's been personally responsible for a 40% increase in data accuracy over the past 2 years. But sure, maybe the intern fresh out of school has cracked the code we've all been missing. The sarcasm dripped from every word. Around the table, laptops suddenly became very interesting as team members found reasons to avoid eye contact. That afternoon, Kayla stayed late again, diving deeper into the company's data architecture. What she found made her pulse quicken, not just errors, but opportunities so clear they practically jumped off the screen. Brian's models were missing entire revenue streams, overlooking customer behaviors that could transform their approach. Still here? She looked up to find Marcus, the CEO, standing by her desk. In his early 30s with kind eyes and an easy smile, he had a reputation for actually caring about employee input, a rarity in startup culture where ego often trumped insight. Just finishing up some analysis, Kayla said, quickly minimizing her unauthorized research. Don't work too late. The data will still be there tomorrow. He paused, glancing at her screen. Though from what I can see, you're finding some interesting patterns. Brian keeping you busy? There was something in his tone, not quite concern, but attention. Like he was paying closer attention to team dynamics than most CEOs bothered with. He's teaching me a lot, Kayla said diplomatically. Marcus nodded slowly. Learning is good. Just remember, the best insights often come from fresh perspectives. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. After he left, Kayla sat in the quiet office, surrounded by the ghosts of missed opportunities and buried insights. Tomorrow would bring another day of Brian's public dismissals, another day of watching valuable intelligence get ignored because it came from the wrong source. But she was learning something Brian couldn't teach her: patience. Every correction she made in the shadows, every insight she quietly documented, every small improvement she implemented without fanfare was building towards something larger. She didn't know what that something was yet, but she could feel it coming. Like storm clouds gathering on a clear day, change was inevitable. Brian Morrison might have won these early battles, but Kayla Washington was playing a much longer game. And she was very, very good at games. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as Innovate Tech's core team assembled for what Brian had dramatically dubbed the rehearsal that could change everything. Next week's investor pitch would determine whether the company secured the $15 million in Series B funding they desperately needed, and everyone felt the weight of that reality. Kayla sat in the back corner, her usual spot during important meetings, with a notebook full of insights she'd never be allowed to share. The past month had taught her to observe rather than participate, to absorb rather than contribute. But today felt different. Today, the data she'd been quietly analyzing could actually matter. All right, people, Brian announced, commanding the room's attention as he connected his laptop to the massive wall display. This presentation is going to knock Peterson Ventures off their feet. I've spent weeks perfecting these projections, and they're bulletproof. Marcus sat at the head of the conference table, flanked by the department heads and senior analysts. His expression was focused but relaxed, the kind of confidence that came from trusting his team to deliver. Kayla found herself watching him, wondering what it was like to have that kind of faith in people. Our customer acquisition strategy has been a massive success, Brian began, clicking through slides filled with colorful charts and impressive-looking numbers. We've seen a 43% increase in new users over the past quarter, with projections showing continued growth through Q4 and beyond. Kayla's pen tightened in her grip. She'd run those exact numbers 3 times. The real increase was 31%, and the growth projections were based on incomplete data that ignored significant seasonal variations. But she'd learned to stay quiet. Our retention rates are industry-leading, Brian continued, his confidence growing with each slide. Customer satisfaction is through the roof, and our churn rate has dropped to historic lows. More embellished numbers. Kayla had documented the real retention figures, cross-referenced them with industry standards, and identified specific pain points that were driving customers away. The churn rate Brian was reporting was achievable, but only if they addressed the issues she'd discovered, issues that apparently didn't exist in Brian's world. Now, for our expansion strategy. Brian clicked to a slide showing geographic markets. We're focusing on our core demographics in major metropolitan areas. Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, the big fish that will drive serious revenue. This was where Kayla's analysis diverged most dramatically from Brian's approach. She'd spent weeks studying user behavior patterns, analyzing demographic data, and identifying untapped markets. What she'd found was a goldmine hiding in plain sight. Questions so far? Brian asked, scanning the room with the satisfaction of someone who expected only praise. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The geographic strategy makes sense for immediate impact, but are we missing any opportunities? Sometimes the biggest wins come from unexpected places. It was a perfectly diplomatic question, the kind that invited broader thinking without challenging anyone directly. Several team members nodded, clearly having their own thoughts about untapped potential. Kayla felt her heart rate spike. This was her opening, maybe her only chance to contribute something meaningful. The data was so clear, so compelling, that surely even Brian would have to listen. She raised her hand tentatively. Yes? Marcus noticed before Brian could shut her down. I've been analyzing our user acquisition patterns, Kayla began, her voice stronger than she expected. And there's actually a significant opportunity we might be overlooking. The Pacific Northwest, specifically the Seattle and Portland markets, show incredibly strong engagement rates with our beta features. Higher than any of our current major markets. The room was paying attention now. Even Brian had paused his presentation, though his expression was shifting from surprise to irritation. The demographic profile is perfect. Kayla continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. Tech-savvy, higher income, early adopters who are willing to pay premium prices for quality service. But we're barely marketing there. If we shifted just 15% of our LA budget to targeted campaigns in these areas, we could see a... Okay, hold up there. Brian interrupted, his voice carrying that familiar condescending tone that made everyone in the room tense. That's cute, Kayla. But we don't need rookie experiments when we're trying to secure $15 million. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. Tom from sales grinned and shook his head like he just heard something adorable but ridiculous. Jennifer from marketing covered her smile with her hand, shooting a quick glance at her colleagues. Brian, Marcus said quietly, but Brian was already rolling. Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, I really do, Brian continued, his smirk growing wider as he played to his audience. But we're not going to pivot our entire strategy based on some intern's weekend research project. These investors want to see proven results, not theoretical maybes from markets nobody's ever heard of. The chuckles got louder. David from the finance team actually laughed out loud, and even Sarah, who'd been one of Kayla's few allies, looked down at her notes with obvious discomfort. Portland and Seattle? Brian continued, really warming up now. What's next? Are we going to start targeting farmers in Iowa because they have good Wi-Fi? Come on, people. Let's stick to the grown-up conversation. Kayla felt the heat rise in her cheeks as the room's energy shifted entirely. What had started as professional interest in her idea had transformed into entertainment at her expense. She was no longer a team member offering insights. She was the naive intern who'd forgotten her place. I just thought, she began weakly. And that's the problem right there. Brian cut her off with theatrical exasperation. You thought. But thinking isn't your job here. Your job is to learn from people who actually know what they're doing. Marcus's expression had changed, but Brian was too caught up in his performance to notice. Several team members were now actively avoiding eye contact with Kayla, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Kayla lowered her gaze to her notebook, where weeks of careful analysis and compelling data suddenly felt worthless. The numbers that had seemed so important, so revolutionary, now looked like the naive scribblings of someone who didn't understand how the real world worked. Now then, Brian said, turning back to his presentation with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully put an upstart in their place. Let's get back to strategies that might actually work. As I was saying about our Los Angeles expansion. The meeting continued around her, but Kayla barely heard another word. She sat in her corner, staring at the research that could have changed everything, feeling smaller than she had since her first day. In a room full of smart, ambitious people, she'd been reduced to a punchline. And the worst part was, she was starting to believe maybe Brian was right. Maybe thinking wasn't her job after all. 1 week later, the Innovate Tech conference room had been transformed into what Brian called the arena where dreams come true. The mahogany table gleamed under carefully adjusted lighting, branded water bottles sat at perfect intervals, and the wall display showed the company logo with military precision. Everything was designed to impress Peterson Ventures, the investment firm that could either launch Innovate Tech into the stratosphere or leave them scrambling for survival. Kayla sat in the same back corner where she'd been humiliated during the rehearsal, but today she felt different. Not confident, Brian had made sure of that, but observant. She'd spent the past week watching him fine-tune his presentation, refusing her quiet offers to double-check his calculations, dismissing her concerns with increasingly dramatic eye rolls. "They're here," whispered Tom from sales, peeking through the conference room's glass walls as 3 impeccably dressed figures walked through the office. Peterson Ventures had arrived, and with them, $15 million of potential future. Richard Peterson himself led the group, a silver-haired man in his 60s whose reputation for due diligence was legendary in Silicon Valley. Behind him walked Dr. Sarah Chin, Peterson's data analytics specialist who'd reportedly killed more deals with her mathematical precision than most people closed in their entire careers. The third investor, David Kumar, was younger but known for asking the kinds of questions that exposed weaknesses others missed. "Showtime," Brian muttered, straightening his tie and flashing that practiced smile that had charmed so many people over the years. Marcus entered the room with the Peterson team, making introductions and small talk while everyone settled into their seats. The investors' expressions were politely neutral, the kind of professional masks that revealed nothing while evaluating everything. "Gentlemen, Dr. Chin," Brian began, his voice carrying perfect pitch and confidence. "Thank you for taking the time to see what we've built here at Innovate Tech. I think you're going to be very impressed with our growth trajectory and market positioning." The first 15 minutes went smoothly. Brian clicked through slides showcasing the company's vision, user interface improvements, and competitive advantages. His delivery was polished, his slides were visually striking, and his energy was infectious. Even Kayla had to admit he knew how to work a room. Then came the numbers. "Our customer acquisition has been extraordinary," Brian announced, clicking to his favorite slide, the one showing dramatic upward curves and impressive percentages. 43% growth in new users over the past quarter, with retention rates that are absolutely industry-leading. Dr. Chin leaned forward slightly, her laptop open and fingers moving across the keyboard with surgical precision. Kayla felt her stomach tighten. Those were the exact numbers she'd flagged as inflated, the ones Brian had refused to let her correct. "Customer satisfaction is through the roof," Brian continued, warming to his favorite topic. "Our churn rate has dropped to historic lows. We're talking about 4.2% monthly churn, which in this industry is practically unheard of." More wrong numbers. Kayla's real analysis showed 6.8% monthly churn, Still competitive, but nowhere near the fantasy Brian was selling. She documented it carefully, cross-referenced it with 3 different data sources, and tried multiple times to share the corrections. The revenue projections are equally exciting, Brian said, clicking to a slide that made Kayla's heart sink. Based on these trends, we're looking at 300% revenue growth over the next 18 months, with expansion into major markets driving the majority of that increase. Dr. Chen's typing had become more rapid. Richard Peterson was making notes with the kind of focused attention that could either mean fascination or concern. David Kumar was staring at the wall display with an expression Kayla couldn't read. "Those are impressive numbers," Dr. Chen said finally, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone who'd found something interesting. "Could you walk us through the methodology behind the churn calculation? The 4.2% figure specifically." Brian's confidence didn't waver. "Absolutely. We're using standard industry calculations based on monthly user activity and subscription renewals. Pretty straightforward stuff, really." Dr. Chen clicked through something on her laptop. "Because when I cross-referenced that with your earlier financial reports and the market research we conducted independently, I'm seeing some significant inconsistencies." The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Marcus, who'd been leaning back comfortably, sat up straighter. Several team members exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to growing alarm. "Inconsistencies?" Brian asked, but for the first time, his voice carried a slight edge. "The customer acquisition numbers, for instance." David Kumar joined in, his own laptop now open. "Your Q3 report to the market showed 31% growth. Today you're telling us 43%. That's a pretty significant discrepancy for the same time period." Kayla felt like she was watching a car accident in slow motion. Those were exactly the numbers she tried to correct. Brian's inflated presentation figures versus the accurate data from the actual quarterly reports. "Well," Brian said, his smile starting to look forced, "there might be some variation in how we're calculating the time frames. And the churn rate," Dr. Chen continued relentlessly. "Our preliminary analysis suggests it's closer to 6.8%, possibly higher. The 4.2 figure appears to exclude several significant customer categories." The silence in the room was deafening. Kayla could see sweat beginning to form on Brian's forehead despite the air conditioning. Marcus's expression had shifted from relaxed confidence to sharp attention. That is," Brian stammered, his legendary smoothness deserting him at the worst possible moment. "There might be some confusion in the data compilation process." "Confusion?" Richard Peterson spoke for the first time since the presentation began, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone listen. "Mr. Morrison, we're talking about potentially investing $15 million. Confusion isn't really something we can work with." Brian's face was flushed now, his carefully styled hair looking somehow disheveled despite not being touched. He clicked frantically through his slides as if the right chart might somehow save him. "The data is solid," he insisted, but his voice had lost all its earlier conviction. "If there are discrepancies, it's probably because—" He paused, his eyes scanning the room desperately before landing on Kayla in her corner seat. The moment stretched like eternity. Kayla could see the calculation happening behind Brian's eyes, the decision to sacrifice someone else to save himself. "Our intern must have slipped up," he said finally, his voice turning cold and deliberate. "She's been helping with data compilation, and well, she's still learning the ropes. Sometimes these things happen when you're training junior staff." Every head in the room turned toward Kayla. The investors' expressions shifted from skeptical to uncomfortable as they realized they were witnessing something beyond mere data errors. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Kayla felt the weight of $15 million, her entire career, and her professional reputation crashing down on her shoulders. She stared down at her notebook, the same notebook filled with the correct figures that could have prevented this exact disaster, and felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. "I see," Dr. Chen said quietly, her tone suggesting she saw far more than just numbers. The conference room fell silent except for the subtle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the office beyond the glass walls. Kayla kept her eyes fixed on her hands, feeling the burn of embarrassment, and something much deeper, the crushing weight of being blamed for someone else's failures in front of the people who mattered most. In the corner of her vision, she could see Brian wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, desperately trying to regain control of a presentation that had already slipped beyond saving. But for Kayla Washington, the presentation had become secondary to a much more painful realization. In Brian's world, she would always be expendable. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Dr. Chen's fingers had stopped moving across her keyboard. Richard Peterson was studying Brian with the kind of clinical attention usually reserved for failed specimens. David Kumar had closed his laptop entirely, apparently having seen enough. Brian cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain control. "Look, these minor discrepancies can easily be." "Minor?" Dr. Chen interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Morrison, we're talking about fundamental misrepresentations of your company's performance. The variance between reported and actual figures suggests either incompetence or deliberate." "Now hold on." Brian's voice cracked slightly. "I won't stand here and have my integrity questioned because some intern made a few data entry mistakes." He gestured toward Kayla again, doubling down on his scapegoating with increasing desperation. "She's fresh out of school, barely been here 2 months. This is exactly the kind of rookie error that happens when you're trying to give people opportunities they're not ready for." Marcus, who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table, stood up slowly. His movement was deliberate, controlled, and somehow commanded every person's attention without him saying a single word. "Actually, Brian," Marcus said, his voice carrying a calm authority that made the room go dead silent, "I think there's something you need to understand." He walked around the conference table with measured steps, his eyes never leaving Brian's increasingly panicked face. The investors watched with fascination as the dynamics in the room shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. "Those figures you're calling errors?" Marcus continued, stopping directly behind Kayla's chair. "The ones you're blaming on inexperience and rookie mistakes?" Kayla felt her heart hammering as Marcus placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She looked up at him, confused and terrified about what was happening, but his expression was warm and reassuring, completely different from the cold professionalism he'd shown during the presentation. "Those were actually Kayla's corrections," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger. "She spent weeks identifying the exact discrepancies Dr. Chen just pointed out. She tried multiple times to share her findings with you, Brian. You shut her down every single time." Brian's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. What are you?" "Marcus, I don't understand what you're—" "Of course you don't understand," Marcus interrupted, his tone remaining eerily calm while his words carried the weight of judgment. "Because you've been too busy performing for an audience to actually listen to the smartest person in this room." Then Marcus did something that changed everything. He leaned down and kissed Kayla gently on the cheek, the kind of familiar, intimate gesture that spoke of years of shared mornings and quiet conversations. The kind of kiss that belonged to people who knew each other's dreams and fears and everything in between. The conference room erupted in shocked whispers and gasps. Jennifer from marketing audibly choked on her water. Tom from sales stared with his mouth hanging open. Sarah's eyes went wide as understanding dawned across her face. "You see," Marcus said, straightening up and addressing the investors directly while keeping his hand protectively on Kayla's shoulder. "What Brian doesn't realize is that Kayla Washington isn't just our intern. She's Kayla Morrison." The words hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite exploded yet. "Morrison?" Richard Peterson repeated, his eyebrows raised in intrigue. "Well, she kept her maiden name professionally," Marcus said with a slight smile, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since the presentation began falling apart. "But yes, Kayla is my wife. And those insights Brian keeps dismissing? That analytical brilliance he's been trying to bury under busy work and public humiliation? That's exactly why I married her." The room didn't just go quiet, it went silent in the way that happens when reality shifts so dramatically that people need time to recalibrate their entire understanding of what they've been witnessing. Brian's face had gone through several color changes, finally settling on a pale green that matched the company's logo. His mouth moved soundlessly, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Actually, Marcus continued, turning back to the investors, those corrected figures Kayla compiled? They're sitting right there in her notebook. The real customer acquisition rate, the accurate churn calculations, the market analysis that Brian called rookie experiments, it's all there. She's been trying to help this company succeed while being told her job was to shut up and crunch numbers. Dr. Chen leaned forward with renewed interest. May we see those figures? Of course, Marcus said, but he looked down at Kayla first. If that's okay with you? Kayla nodded, still too stunned to speak. She opened her notebook with trembling hands and passed it across the table. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailed calculations, cross-reference data points, and market insights that painted a picture of a company with real potential, but also real challenges that needed honest acknowledgement. As Dr. Chin, Peterson, and Kumar pored over Kayla's work, Marcus turned his attention back to Brian, who was still frozen in place like a statue of corporate embarrassment. You know what's interesting, Brian? Marcus said conversationally. For 2 months, I've been getting reports about team dynamics, about how our newest intern was struggling to adapt, about how she needed more guidance and supervision. Brian's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. But what I was actually seeing, Marcus continued, was my wife coming home frustrated because she'd identified problems that could save this company money and missed opportunities that could make us millions, only to be told that thinking wasn't her job. The investors had stopped reading and were now watching this corporate drama unfold with the kind of fascination usually reserved for reality television. So I started paying closer attention, Marcus said. And what I discovered was that the person being labeled as inexperienced and incompetent was actually the only one in this room who had the complete picture. He gestured to Kayla's notebook. Those Pacific Northwest markets you laughed at during the rehearsal? Seattle and Portland? According to the research my wife compiled, they represent a potential 47% increase in high-value customers within 18 months. But apparently that was just a weekend research project not worth considering. Brian finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. I had no idea she was. You had no idea she was what? Marcus asked, his tone sharpening for the first time. Smart? Capable? Worth listening to? Because her last name and her relationship to me shouldn't have mattered. Her ideas should have spoken for themselves. The room was dead silent except for the sound of Dr. Chen turning pages in Kayla's notebook and making impressed humming sounds. Well, Richard Peterson said finally, a slow smile spreading across his face. This has certainly been the most interesting pitch meeting I've attended in 20 years. Brian remained frozen, his career and reputation crumbling around him in real time, while Kayla sat in stunned silence, still processing that her worst professional moment had somehow transformed into something entirely different. The game had changed completely, and everyone in the room was still figuring out what the new rules were. Dr. Chen looked up from Kayla's notebook, her expression transformed from skeptical investor to engaged analyst. This market segmentation analysis is remarkably thorough. The demographic breakdowns, the behavioral patterns, the revenue projections, this is exactly the kind of deep dive we look for in our due diligence process. Richard Peterson nodded slowly, his earlier concern replaced by genuine curiosity. The numbers tell a completely different story than what we heard in the presentation. More conservative in some areas, but also more opportunity-rich. Marcus squeezed Kayla's shoulder gently. Why don't you walk them through it? He suggested, his voice carrying both encouragement and pride. These are your insights, your analysis. You should be the one presenting them. Kayla felt her heart rate spike for entirely different reasons now. The past hour had been an emotional whiplash from humiliation to revelation, and now she was being asked to present to the very investors who just watched her get blamed for someone else's failures. I don't know if. She stammered, glancing around the room at faces that ranged from supportive to stunned to mortified. Hey, Marcus said softly, leaning down so only she could hear. Remember what you told me last night? About how their current strategy was missing the biggest opportunity in their target market? Show them what you showed me. Kayla took a deep breath, stood slowly, and walked toward the front of the room. Brian, still frozen near the presentation screen, stepped aside like he was moving through thick fog. The confident, domineering manager who'd entered this room an hour ago had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd forgotten how to breathe. Okay, Kayla said, her voice barely above a whisper at first. She cleared her throat and tried again. Okay. So, the first thing is that our current data has some significant accuracy issues that have been skewing our projections. She clicked to a new slide, pulling up a clean presentation she'd prepared weeks ago but never been allowed to share. Her hands were trembling slightly, but her voice was growing stronger. The real customer acquisition rate over the past quarter was 31%, not 43%. That's still excellent growth, but it's important to base our projections on accurate baselines. David Kumar leaned forward, making notes. What was causing the inflation in the original figures? A combination of factors. Kayla explained, finding her rhythm as she moved deeper into familiar territory. Double counting of users who upgraded their accounts, inclusion of trial users who never converted to paid subscriptions, and some seasonal variations that weren't properly adjusted for. She clicked to the next slide, showing the corrected retention analysis. Our churn rate is 6.8% monthly, which is actually still very competitive in our market segment. But understanding the real number helps us identify where we're losing customers and why. Dr. Chen was typing rapidly again, but this time her expression was one of engagement rather than skepticism. Have you identified the primary churn drivers? Yes, Kayla said, her confidence building with each question. The biggest losses are happening in the 25 to 34 demographic during their third month of service. The data suggests it's tied to feature discovery. Users aren't finding the advanced tools that would make the platform sticky for them. She clicked through several more slides, each one showing a different aspect of her analysis. The room's energy had completely shifted. Instead of watching a disaster unfold, the investors were now seeing the kind of data-driven insights that made companies worth investing in. But here's where it gets really interesting. Kayla continued, clicking to her market expansion analysis. Everyone's been focusing on major metropolitan areas, LA, New York, Chicago. But there's a huge opportunity hiding in plain sight. She pulled up a map showing user engagement rates across different regions. The Pacific Northwest, specifically Seattle, Portland, and the surrounding tech corridors, shows engagement rates that are 43% higher than our current best markets. Richard Peterson's eyebrows shot up. 43% higher? Higher income, higher tech adoption, and most importantly, they're willing to pay premium prices for quality service. Kayla explained, her nervousness evaporating as she dove into the data she'd been dying to share. Our few existing users in these markets have an average customer lifetime value that's 67% higher than our national average. She clicked to the next slide, showing detailed demographic breakdowns and market penetration analysis. We're essentially invisible in these markets right now. Less than 2% market penetration. But the user behavior data suggests that with targeted marketing, we could capture significant market share very quickly. Dr. Chen looked up from her laptop. What kind of investment would be required for that expansion? That's the beautiful part, Kayla said, her excitement now completely overriding any lingering nervousness. We wouldn't need to build new infrastructure. Our current platform already serves these markets. It's purely a marketing and customer acquisition play. She clicked to a detailed financial projection. If we shifted 15% of our Los Angeles marketing budget to targeted campaigns in Seattle and Portland, the modeling suggests we could see a 180% return on that investment within 12 months. David Kumar was no longer just taking notes, he was actively calculating on his own device. And the scalability potential? Enormous, Kayla replied, clicking to her final slide showing regional expansion possibilities. The Pacific Northwest is just the beginning. Similar demographic patterns exist in Austin, Denver, Research Triangle in North Carolina. We're looking at potential markets that could triple our addressable customer base. The room had gone quiet again, but this was the focused silence of people processing genuinely exciting information. Marcus watched from his seat with obvious pride, while Brian remained motionless near the wall, apparently still trying to comprehend how completely the tables had turned. These projections are based on what data set? Richard Peterson asked. 18 months of user behavior analysis, cross-reference with census data, market research from similar platforms, and spending pattern analysis from financial services data, Kayla answered without hesitation. I can walk you through the methodology for any specific calculation. Dr. Chen closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. This is the most compelling market expansion strategy we've seen this quarter. The fact that it's backed by this level of analytical rigor makes it even more impressive. The conservative projections alone would justify the investment, David Kumar added. But if the optimistic scenarios play out, we're talking about fundamentally changing the company's growth trajectory. Kayla stood at the front of the room, still holding the remote control, watching three of the most influential investors in Silicon Valley nod approvingly at work she'd done in her corner desk while being told her job was to stay quiet and follow instructions. Well, Richard Peterson said, looking around the room with a slight smile, I think we've heard enough to move forward with serious discussions. Kayla, would you be leading the implementation of this expansion strategy? Before she could answer, Marcus stood up. Actually, that's something we'll need to discuss internally. There might be some organizational changes in our immediate future. His eyes briefly met Brian's, and the message was unmistakably clear. For the first time in 2 months, Kayla Washington felt like she belonged in that conference room. Not as an intern who should be grateful for the opportunity to fetch coffee and input data, but as someone whose ideas could actually change everything. The game hadn't just changed, she'd won it. The Peterson Ventures team left Innovate Tech 2 hours later with handshakes, business cards, and a preliminary term sheet that exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. As their black sedan pulled away from the curb, Marcus stood in the lobby watching them go, then turned back toward the elevator with the measured pace of someone who had serious decisions to make. The office buzzed with a different energy now. Word had spread quickly through the open workspace about what had happened in the conference room, and clusters of employees huddled around desks, whispering about the dramatic reversal they'd witnessed. Some had watched through the glass walls as their supposedly incompetent intern transformed into the star of the most important presentation in company history. Did you see Brian's face when Marcus kissed her cheek? Jennifer from marketing whispered to Tom from sales. I can't believe she's been his wife this whole time. Sarah murmured to a group gathered near the coffee machine. All those times he humiliated her in meetings. Kayla had retreated to her corner desk, still processing everything that had happened. Her notebook lay open beside her laptop, the same notebook that had been dismissed as rookie scribblings just hours ago, and was now being called the most compelling market strategy Peterson Ventures had seen all quarter. Marcus appeared at her desk, pulling up a chair beside her. How are you feeling? Like I just lived through someone else's life, Kayla admitted, her voice still carrying traces of disbelief. This morning I was the intern who couldn't be trusted with anything important. You were never that, Marcus said firmly. You were always the smartest person in the room. The only thing that changed today was that everyone else finally figured it out. Across the office, Brian's desk sat empty. He'd left immediately after the meeting, mumbling something about needing air and never returning. His coffee cup still sat beside his keyboard, his screensaver cycling through company motivational quotes that now seemed bitterly ironic. What happens now? Kayla asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Well, Peterson wants to move forward with the funding. They're particularly interested in having you lead the market expansion project. And Brian? Brian won't be leading any projects here anymore, Marcus said, his tone leaving no room for interpretation. What happened today, that wasn't just about bad data or poor judgment. That was about character. And character matters more than competence when you're building a team. That evening, Marcus called an emergency board meeting. In the same conference room where Kayla had been publicly humiliated just hours earlier, he addressed the 5 board members with characteristic directness. "We have a problem," he began. "And we have an opportunity. The problem is that we've been systematically underutilizing our best analytical talent because it came packaged in a way that didn't match our expectations. The opportunity is that we now know exactly how valuable that talent is." He pulled up the Peterson Ventures preliminary term sheet on the wall display. $15 million. 20% higher valuation than we hoped for. And it's entirely because of work that our intern had been trying to share for 2 months. Board member Patricia Chin raised her hand. "What are you proposing?" "Brian Morrison is being removed from the analytics department effective immediately," Marcus said without hesitation. "His handling of both data accuracy and team management has been unacceptable. Kayla will be taking over the market expansion project and transitioning from intern to senior strategic analyst." The vote was unanimous. The next morning, Kayla walked through the glass doors of Innovate Tech for what felt like the first time, even though she'd been making the same walk for 2 months. But everything was different now. "Morning, Kayla," called Jake from marketing, looking up from his desk with a genuine smile. "Heard you absolutely crushed it yesterday. That presentation was incredible," added Maria from HR, who'd never spoken to her before. "I had no idea you'd been working on all that research." As Kayla made her way through the office, she noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs of change. People met her eyes instead of looking through her. Conversations paused as she passed, but with interest rather than awkwardness. Several team members she'd barely interacted with nodded respectfully or offered small waves. Her corner desk had been replaced with a workspace in the center of the analytics department, complete with dual monitors and a chair that didn't squeak when she moved. A nameplate reading, "Kayla Washington, Senior Strategic Analyst," sat prominently on the desk, along with a small bouquet of flowers from Sarah with a note that read, "Finally. Team meeting in 5, called David from finance, addressing the analytics department. "Kayla's going to walk us through the new market expansion strategy." As she gathered her materials, the same notebook that had been dismissed and ridiculed, now treated like a strategic roadmap, Kayla reflected on how much had changed in 24 hours. She was still the same person with the same ideas and the same analytical skills. But now, for the first time, she was in an environment where those qualities were valued rather than suppressed. The conference room filled with team members who looked at her with curiosity and respect. No more eye rolls when she spoke. No more dismissive chuckles when she offered suggestions. No more sitting in the corner, invisible and unheard. "All right, everyone," Kayla began, standing at the front of the room with confidence that felt both new and completely natural. "Let's talk about how we're going to triple our addressable market." As she clicked to her first slide, she caught sight of the empty chair where Brian used to hold court, commanding attention through volume and intimidation. His absence left space for something better: collaboration, respect, and the radical idea that good ideas could come from anyone, regardless of their title or position in the hierarchy. "The Pacific Northwest market represents our biggest opportunity," Kayla continued, her voice strong and clear. "And here's exactly how we're going to capture it." Around the table, her colleagues, because that's what they were now, colleagues, not people who barely tolerated her presence, leaned forward with genuine interest. Outside the conference room windows, San Francisco sparkled in the morning sun, full of possibilities that hadn't existed yesterday. For the first time since walking through those glass doors 2 months ago, Kayla Washington felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had finally recognized her potential, but because she'd never stopped believing in it herself. And sometimes, that's all the victory you need.